An aging black mechanic was quietly repairing an old car in his small garage when a young man, thin and soaked in snow, stepped inside. His trembling voice begged for a job to help pay for his mother's cancer treatment. The young man's devotion touched the mechanic's heart, so without hesitation he hired him, taught him everything he knew, and even withdrew every dollar he had saved over a lifetime so the boy's mother could begin treatment. He never knew that years later the young man would return successful and determined to repay him with the same kindness that had once saved his life. Before we continue, tell us what time it is and where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe and hype because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. The snow fell steadily against the corrugated metal roof of Theodore "Teddy" Barnes's auto repair shop, creating a soft whisper that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. At 68 years old, Teddy had been turning wrenches for nearly 5 decades, his weathered hands telling the story of countless engines rebuilt, transmissions repaired, and dreams kept alive one vehicle at a time. The shop on Elm Street wasn't much to look at, a converted garage with oil-stained concrete floors and walls lined with decades-old calendars and faded photographs of classic cars, but to the working-class families of Cedar Grove it was a lifeline. Teddy's prices were fair, his work was honest, and he never turned anyone away, even when their wallets were lighter than their problems were heavy. This Tuesday morning in mid-December started like any other. Teddy arrived before dawn, brewing his first pot of coffee in the ancient percolator that had been his companion since the late 80s. The familiar sounds of the awakening neighborhood filtered through the walls, school buses rumbling past, dogs barking their morning greetings, and the distant whistle of the early morning freight train that carried timber from the mills up north. Teddy was bent over the engine of Mrs. Helen Kowalski's old Honda Civic, a car that had seen better days but still carried her faithfully to her job at the diner, when he heard the hesitant footsteps outside. Through the frost-covered window he glimpsed a slight figure pacing back and forth in the falling snow, gathering courage for something. The knock, when it finally came, was barely audible above the gentle sound of falling snow. "Come on in," Teddy called, wiping his hands on a red shop rag that had seen more oil changes than he could count. Doors open. The young white man who stepped inside was 18, maybe 19, with sandy brown hair dusted with fresh snow and clothes that had seen too many washings. His sneakers left wet prints on the concrete floor, melting snow pooling around his feet as he stood there shivering. What struck Teddy most, though, were the boy's eyes, blue as a summer sky but clouded with worry far too heavy for someone so young. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you Mr. Barnes?" "That's me," Teddy replied, studying the young man's face, "though most folks just call me Teddy. What can I do for you, son?" The boy, he looked more like a child standing there, dwarfed by the cavernous shop, shifted nervously from foot to foot. "My name's Luke Hastings. I live over on Pine Street with my mom. I heard you sometimes help folks out when they're in trouble." Teddy had heard that story before, more times than he cared to count. It usually involved a car that wouldn't start, a repair bill that might as well have been a mortgage payment, and a family caught between pride and desperation. He'd learned long ago to listen first, judge never. "Depends on what kind of trouble we're talking about," Teddy said gently, pulling up a worn wooden stool. "Why don't you sit a spell and tell me what's on your mind?" Luke remained standing, his hands clasped so tightly in front of him that his knuckles had gone white. "It's not about a car, Mr. Teddy. It's about my mom. She's really sick." The words tumbled out then, as if a dam had finally burst. Luke's mother, Catherine, had been fighting breast cancer for 2 years. The treatments had drained their savings, forced them to sell everything they owned of value, and still the bills kept coming. She'd been getting better, the doctors had said, but last month the cancer had returned with a vengeance. "She needs this new treatment," Luke continued, his voice growing thicker with each word. "The insurance won't cover it because they call it experimental, but the doctor says it's her only chance. It costs $15,000 and we don't have anything left." Teddy listened in silence, his calloused hands folded in his lap. He'd lived long enough to know that life had a way of kicking folks when they were already down, but that didn't make it any easier to witness. In the boy's desperate voice, he heard echoes of his own past, a young man facing mountains too tall to climb alone. "What about other family?" Teddy asked quietly. "Anybody else who could help?" Luke shook his head. "It's just been me and Mom since I was 12. My dad, he left when she first got diagnosed. Said he couldn't handle it. The bitterness in those last words could have etched glass. "So what is it you're asking me, son?" Luke took a shuddering breath. "I'll work for you. I'll do anything, sweep floors, organize parts, whatever you need. I'm a fast learner and I'm not afraid of hard work. I just need to borrow the money for Mom's treatment, and I swear I'll pay you back every penny, even if it takes me the rest of my life." Teddy studied the young man's face, the desperate hope warring with the fear of rejection, the pride that made asking for help feel like swallowing glass. He saw something else there too, something that reminded him of himself at that age, a fierce determination to protect the people he loved, no matter the cost. "You got any experience working on cars?" Teddy asked. "Some," Luke replied eagerly. "I've been fixing our old Corolla for the past 3 years, ever since Mom couldn't afford to take it to shops anymore. I learned from YouTube videos mostly, and I bought a repair manual from the used bookstore. I know I'm not a real mechanic, but I'm willing to learn." Teddy nodded slowly. In his 5 decades of working on cars, he'd learned to spot natural talent. More important, he'd learned to recognize character. This boy had both. "Tell you what," Teddy said, standing up from his stool. "Why don't you show me what you can do? Mrs. Kowalski's Civic here needs new brake pads. You think you can handle that?" Luke's eyes widened. "You mean right now? No time like the present. Tools are over there on the pegboard. Let me see what you're made of." For the next 2 hours, Teddy watched as Luke worked with the focused intensity of someone for whom failure wasn't an option. The boy's hands weren't as steady as they would be with experience, and he had to stop several times to think through the process, but his instincts were solid. More importantly, he treated every component with respect, understanding that someone's life might depend on his work. "Not bad," Teddy said when Luke had finished. "Little rough around the edges, but you've got the right idea. Brakes look good and solid." Luke beamed with pride, the first genuine smile Teddy had seen from him. "Does this mean?" "It means you've got yourself a job," Teddy replied. "As for the other thing, well, that's going to take some thinking. $15,000 is a considerable sum." The hope in Luke's eyes dimmed slightly, but he nodded. "I understand, Mr. Teddy. Just having the job means the world to me. When can I start?" "How about right now? I've got a transmission that needs rebuilding, and these old hands could use some young eyes to help spot the problems." As they worked together through the afternoon, Teddy found himself remembering another young man from decades past, himself at 25, standing in a bank manager's office, hat in hand, asking for a loan to start his own shop. The answer had been no, delivered with the kind of polite dismissal that left no room for argument. It had taken him 3 more years of working for other people before he'd saved enough to strike out on his own. But Teddy had been lucky. He'd had time on his side, and his dreams weren't a matter of life and death. This boy didn't have that luxury. That evening, long after Luke had walked home through the snow, Teddy sat in his small office at the back of the shop, staring at a bank statement and doing arithmetic on the back of an envelope. $15,000. It was more than he'd ever loaned to anyone, more than his emergency fund, more than he could afford to lose. But as he watched the snow continue to fall outside his window, Teddy found himself thinking about second chances and the people who had given them to him along the way. His mind wandered back more than 40 years, to a day not unlike this one. More than 4 decades earlier, Teddy was 24 then, fresh out of the army, and full of dreams that seemed as solid as morning mist. He'd learned mechanics in the service, working on everything from Jeeps to helicopters, and he'd come home to Cedar Grove in the early 80s with a plan: save enough money to open his own shop, marry his sweetheart Violet, and build a life worth living. The reality had been harder than the dream. Jobs were scarce in those days, especially for a young black man in a town where some folks still remembered when the diner had separate entrances. Teddy had found work at Anderson's Automotive, a larger shop on the other side of town, but the pay was barely enough to cover rent on his tiny apartment, much less save for the future. He'd been working there 6 months when old man Anderson called him into the office on a gray February morning. "Teddy," Anderson had said, not looking up from his paperwork, "I'm afraid I'm going to have to let you go." The words hit like a physical blow. "Sir, did I do something wrong?" Anderson finally looked up, his weathered face showing something that might have been regret. "You're a good worker, Teddy, maybe the best I've had. But some of my regular customers, they're not comfortable having you work on their cars. It's nothing personal, you understand. It's just business." Teddy had understood. All right. He'd understood that talent didn't matter when prejudice held the scales. He'd walked out of Anderson's shop that day carrying his tools and wondering if his dreams were just elaborate self-deception. But fate had a different plan. 3 blocks from Anderson's shop, Teddy's old Buick had chosen that exact moment to break down. Steam poured from under the hood like a white flag of surrender, and Teddy found himself coasting into the parking lot of a small garage he'd never noticed before. The sign above the door read O'Sullivan's Auto Repair in faded blue letters, and through the open bay doors, Teddy could see an elderly white man bent over the engine of a pickup truck. "Excuse me," Teddy had called out, "my car just overheated. I don't suppose you could take a look." The man straightened up slowly, his hand pressed to his lower back. Declan O'Sullivan was 68 years old, with silver hair and eyes the color of faded denim. He'd been running the shop for 30 years, and he'd seen every kind of car trouble imaginable. "Pop the hood," O'Sullivan had said simply. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Teddy had expected the same polite dismissal he'd grown accustomed to, but O'Sullivan had surprised him. After a brief examination, the older man had diagnosed the problem, a blown radiator hose, and quoted a fair price for the repair. "Only thing is," O'Sullivan had added, "I'm booked solid for the next week." Unless he'd paused, studying Teddy with sharp eyes. "You seem to know your way around an engine. You wouldn't happen to be looking for work, would you?" That question had changed everything. Declan O'Sullivan had been born in County Cork, Ireland, and had come to America as a young man with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable belief in the dignity of honest work. He'd faced his own share of prejudice in the early years, when signs in shop windows read "No Irish Need Apply." Perhaps that shared experience had given him the ability to see past the color of Teddy's skin to the skill in his hands. For 3 years, Teddy had worked alongside O'Sullivan, learning not just the technical aspects of auto repair but the business side as well: how to deal with suppliers, how to estimate jobs fairly, how to build relationships with customers based on trust rather than the lowest bid. O'Sullivan had been more than a boss, he'd been a mentor, a father figure, and eventually a friend. When the older man's arthritis had finally forced him to retire, he'd made Teddy an offer that had seemed too good to be true. "This place could be yours," O'Sullivan had said one evening as they'd locked up the shop together. "I know you don't have the money to buy it outright, but we could work something out. Maybe a partnership at first, then you could buy me out over time." Teddy had been overwhelmed by the generosity of the offer, but practical concerns had forced him to decline. He was planning to marry Violet that summer, and they'd been talking about starting a family. Taking on the debt and responsibility of the shop had seemed too risky. Instead, Teddy had taken a job at the Ford dealership across town, steady work with good benefits and a regular paycheck. It had been the sensible choice, the safe choice, but as he'd watched O'Sullivan close the shop for the final time, Teddy had felt something precious slip away. The dealership job had lasted 15 years. Teddy had been good at it, eventually working his way up to shop foreman, but he'd never forgotten the dream of owning his own place. By the time he'd finally saved enough money to make that dream a reality, he'd been in his early 40s, and the fire in his belly had dimmed to barely glowing embers. Still, he'd done it. He'd found the old garage on Elm Street and turned it into Teddy's Auto Repair. It wasn't the grand enterprise he'd once envisioned, but it was his, and that had been enough. Now sitting in that same shop more than 4 decades later, Teddy found himself thinking about Declan O'Sullivan and the